Welcome back. In our last session, we looked at Paul's departure from Miletus for Tyre and ultimately Caesarea. In the account at Caesarea, Paul encountered a seer named Agabus. From Caesarea, he traveled to Jerusalem and reported to James. The session ended with a riot breaking out in the temple precincts over a false claim that Paul had brought Gentiles into the temple. This leads to Paul being arrested by the Romans. In the current session, we'll look at Paul's attempt to quell the crowd, which is unsuccessful, leading to his being flogged, during which he invoked his Roman citizenship. Then we shall look at his hearing before the Sanhedrin. We now turn to what Paul says to the angry crowd. It amounts to a defense against the charges that are being brought against him. In typical style, Paul begins his defense with the address, men, brothers, and fathers. Then follows with an imperative to pay attention. Listen to my defense. The word used for defense, apologia, is a legal technical term designating a speech in defense of oneself. This is somewhat different to what we would see as an apology based on the English use of the term. Then, the author interjects a comment into the narrative of the speech. When the crowd heard him addressing them in their own language, Hebrew in the text, but most likely Aramaic, as that was the spoken dialect of the day, they grew quieter, so as to hear what Paul would have to say. He begins with biographical information. I am a Jew, Iudaios, born in Tarsus of Cilicia, brought up in this city, namely Jerusalem. I was educated at the feet of Gamaliel, according to the strictness or the exactness of our ancestral law. This is the same Gamaliel we met in chapter 5, cautioning that if the disciples' preaching is truly from God, and the Sanhedrin stifles it, it could be like fighting God himself. Confer Acts 5:39. Kurtz adds that Paul's ability to interpret Jewish scriptures using various rabbinic methods, as evidenced in his letters, is consistent with having studied under a Jewish teacher of the law, and his openness toward Gentiles is consistent with the rabbinic school of Hillel, to which Gamaliel belonged. As a result of this, he was a zealot, one who was zelotes for God, as also is the mob that is trying to kill him. That is, he was on fire for God. In a similar way, Paul exercised that zealousness by persecuting to the point of death the followers of the way, that is, the followers of Jesus. He would arrest, that is, bind, both men and women, and deliver them over to prison. If one does not believe these words of Paul, his words can be corroborated by the high priest and the whole council of elders, that is, the whole Sanhedrin. He then goes on in referring to facts that we know from the 9th chapter of Acts. He receives letters to the brothers before he sets out for Damascus in order to bring back to Jerusalem in chains the followers of the way in order to be punished. Now we have a second account of the Damascus Road experience in Acts. This time it's told to a Jewish audience, that is, the assembled crowd. So Paul notes that on his way to Damascus, as he was approaching Damascus about noon, a great light from the sky suddenly shone around him. This caused Paul to fall to the ground. Note that as in chapter 9, here there also is no horse. Then he heard a voice speaking to him, "Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me?" Not knowing whose voice it was that was addressing him, Saul questions, "Who are you, sir?" Kuria. Note that Greek word kuria has several shades of meaning, from the word used to translate the divine name of God into Greek, to the simple, polite way of one human male saying to another, "Sir." The connotation here seems closer to the latter, that is, sir. It's unlikely that Saul would have sensed that God himself would address him. Paul's narrative of the Damascus Road continues with the response of the voice. "I am Jesus the Nazarene, whom you are persecuting." This is essentially the same as Acts 9 and correctly conveys one of the key insights of the Damascus Road experience, that in persecuting the practitioners of the way, Saul is persecuting Jesus himself. It was this insight that led Paul to the understanding of the body of Christ, which he will expound in his letters to the Romans and the Corinthians. The attention then turns to those who were accompanying Saul and their experience on the road. "Those with me," Paul notes, "saw the light, but did not hear the voice." This is the opposite of the account in Acts 9, where the traveling companions hear the voice, but see no one. Then a detail that did not appear in the Acts 9 account. In response to the revelation of the voice, Paul asks, "What should I do, sir?" To which the voice, now identified explicitly as the Lord, the Kurios, says, "Get up and go to Damascus. There you will be told about everything appointed for you to do." Thus, through this experience, Saul has come to realize that it's not just any voice he's hearing, but the voice of the Lord himself. And so the connotation of kurios shifts to the other side of the spectrum. The account of the experience on the Damascus Road comes to an end with the note that the brightness of the sky that shone on the road had rendered Paul unable to see. Recall that blindness can be an absence of light or an overabundance of light, which is the case here. Again, the Greek is telling. The phrase "brightness of that light" is rendered by the Greek word doxa, which literally means glory, but it also has a connection to the presence of God. The glory of God in the New Testament was a phrase that connoted the presence of God. And so the use of the glory of the light can imply that in that light is a manifestation of the presence of God, which is confirmed by the fact that the voice that speaks is the voice of God. Johnson expresses this well. Once more, the language here is strikingly like that used by Paul himself in a passage that's best understood as a reference to the experience of his calling, as he notes in 2 Corinthians 4:6. "The God who said, 'Let light shine out of darkness,' has shined in our hearts, the light of the knowledge of the glory, the doxa of God, in the face of Jesus Christ." Thus, Paul had to be led into Damascus, guided by his companions. Now the account continues, paralleling Acts 9 with the introduction of Ananias. Ananias is described as a devout observer of the law and highly spoken of or witnessed to by all the Jews who lived in Damascus. This description is not given in Acts 9. Rather, there he's introduced as merely a disciple at Damascus. Kurtz notes that the additional information on Ananias and the law might have been added by Paul since he was now speaking to Jewish authorities in Jerusalem. Paul then explains how this Ananias came to him and stood before him speaking, "Saul, my brother, regain your sight." And at that very moment, Paul recounts, "I regained my sight and saw him." Then Ananias says to Paul, speaks to Paul, telling him the purpose of what he has just experienced. "The God of our ancestors," literally our fathers, "designated or appointed you for a threefold task: to know his will, to see the righteous one, and to hear the sound of his voice." Kurt summarizes this as, quote, "God chose Paul to know the truth and personally encounter the risen Messiah," unquote. Ananias continues, giving the reason for the above tasks. Paul is to be the risen Christ's witness before all to what he has seen and what he has heard. This is critical. The Damascus Road experience has put Paul on a par with the other apostles. Many would try to discredit Paul because he was not an eyewitness to the ministry of Jesus, as were the apostles. Yet, Paul, several times in his writings, affirmed that he was an eyewitness, and that eyewitnessing was in the Damascus Road experience. Then, Ananias prods Paul to the next step. "Why are you delaying? Get up." The verb used here, anastas, comes from the verb anistemi, which is one of the verbs used to denote the resurrection. Thus, in the action that Ananias is about to propose, Paul will enter into a new life. Thus, Ananias continues, "Be baptized and be cleansed of your sins, calling upon his name." This is an expansion of the narrative of Acts 9, which doesn't mention anything about Paul being baptized. The scene then shifts to Jerusalem, where Paul continues the narration with an incident that was also left out of the account of Acts 9. Interestingly, Paul here does not make mention to the disputes with the Jews which are narrated in Acts 9. In fact, they become the reason for the Damascus Jews plotting to kill him, leading to his disciples stealthily lowering him over the city walls in a basket. Paul then continues, noting that he is praying in the temple. In the course of his prayer, he fell into a trance. That is, he experienced a vision, which is another way of saying he had a religious experience. This note of a vision in the temple reminds us of the prophet Isaiah, who recounts his call to God's service through a vision in the temple while praying. In the course of Paul's vision, he sees God speaking to him. God tells Paul, "Hurry, leave Jerusalem at once. They will not accept your testimony about me." Paul responds to the command of God with an objection, recalling his zealous advocacy of the law against the believers in Jesus. He brings up two incidents. First of all, the very incident that brought about a change in Paul's life. They know that from synagogue to synagogue, I used to imprison and beat those who believed in you. It was to imprison believers in Damascus, that Paul was going when he encountered Christ. Johnson comments, this objection of Paul invites his listeners to bear witness to his his sincerity as a persecutor of the Christians. If they do so, they should also be willing to grant the sincerity of his new experience and perspective. But it would not be that simple. The second incident was his compliance in the stoning of Stephen. Paul says, "And when the blood of your witness Stephen was being shed, I myself stood by, giving approval and keeping guard over the cloaks of his murderers," referring to the story recounted at the end of Acts 7:58. Some scholars see a bit of irony in the Stephen reference. Saul has been complicit, an approving witness to the death of Stephen, guarding the stoners' cloaks. Stephen, who dies having a vision of the risen Jesus. Now Paul, having had a vision of the risen Jesus, now finds himself a witness who speaks of Stephen as your witness. But Paul's argument does not persuade the Lord, who reiterates his original command. Go, I shall send you to the Gentiles. What Paul has just recounted, what he saw as his commissioning as an apostle. With that, Paul ends his defense before the crowd. As Paul was not able to convince the Lord regarding his leaving Jerusalem, he was not able to convince the crowd either now. They listened to the account of the commissioning and found that it was too much for them. They lifted their voices and shouted, "Away from the earth with such as this. He does not deserve to live." Literally, it is not proper or fitting for him to live. There's a similar experience of Jesus, narrated in the synagogue at Nazareth, where when Jesus mentions two Gentiles receiving the favor of God, he stopped and carried off to be hurled over a precipice. We find that in Luke 4:29. Here, Paul is stopped and declared worthy of death when he tells this crowd that he was sent by God to the Gentiles. Kurtz implies that outreach to the Gentiles may have infuriated the Jews because they do not keep the Mosaic law, and reaching out to them seems a repudiation of Israel's standing as God's chosen people. In both cases, the note of universalism produces a violent negative reaction. The situation here seemingly was getting quite out of hand. The assembly was yelling and throwing off their cloaks and flinging dust in the air. All of these actions have been seen elsewhere in Acts as a somewhat negative reaction, having power to avert evil influences or bad luck. As a result, the tribune ordered that Paul be led into the barracks, the Fortress Antonia, and further commanded that he be examined by flogging. Again, we need to look at a Greek verb, anataxo, which generally means to examine juridically. But when it's coupled with the noun mastix, it takes on the sense of examination under the whip or under the lash. This was not an unusual occurrence. The purpose is then stated: to see why this crowd was so violently angry over him. What was it that caused such a commotion over Paul? When the soldiers were preparing Paul for whipping, the Greek verb here has the sense of stretching out one's hands in preparation for whipping. Paul questions the centurion concerning the legality of flogging a Roman citizen, who has not been tried or convicted. The Greek implies that there has been no judgment or verdict which would follow a proper trial. This is the second time that Paul invokes his Roman citizenship. Recall that he claimed the rights of a Roman citizen in Philippi when he was publicly beaten and imprisoned in Acts 16:37-39. Johnson notes that Paul's timing here is better than it was at Philippi. That is, he invokes his citizenship prior to the flogging rather than after it, as he did in Philippi. Upon Paul's question, the centurion goes immediately to the tribune to report this new finding. "What are you going to do?" he asks the tribune. "This man is a Roman citizen." The tribune proceeds to question Paul to determine the veracity of the centurion's news. "Tell me, are you a Roman citizen?" To which Paul responds, "Yes." Then the tribune presents a bit of background concerning his own Roman citizenship. "I acquired this citizenship for a large sum of money." This was a legitimate way for a person not born a citizen to become a citizen. Paul then proudly states, "I was born a Roman citizen." For many, it was customary to purchase citizenship in the first century, as attested by the writings of Dio Cassius and Josephus. Further, Johnson notes that it was customary for one purchasing citizenship to take the name of the emperor in whose reign they acquired citizenship. Hence, since the tribune is Claudius Lysias, it is possible that he purchased his citizenship during the reign of Claudius, thus between the years of 41 and 54. The result of this short conversation between Paul and the tribune Claudius Lysias, was that those who were going to interrogate him with the whip backed away, and Claudius Lysias himself became fearful when he realized that the prisoner he had bound and was about to flog was a Roman citizen. Recall that Roman law protected citizens from interrogation under torture or flogging without a trial. Bach cites Cicero in that regard. Cicero says to bind a Roman citizen is a crime, to flog him an abomination, and to slay him almost an act of murder. The appeal to Roman citizenship is not going to stop the tribune, however, from getting the reason for all the commotion. If he can't get at the truth by flogging, then he must try some other means. And the next most viable means was to bring Paul before the Sanhedrin to see if they can get the truth out of him. So the next day, the tribune, wanting to determine the truth with certainty, why the Jews were accusing Paul, and what exactly they were accusing him of, approached the Jews, since he could not get information from Paul. He untied Paul, which at the same time ordered the chief priests and the whole Sanhedrin to assemble. Now the question is asked as to whether a tribune could issue such an order. Johnson notes that there is one occasion recorded in which the procurator claimed the right to convene the Sanhedrin. It is found in his Antiquities of the Book of the Jews, Book 20, Chapter 202. And so once the entire Sanhedrin was assembled, the tribune brought Paul in and had him stand before them. This sets the scene for yet another speech of defense by Paul. The author notes that Paul looks intently at the members of the Sanhedrin. Again, there is an allusion to the stoning of Stephen. As they're stoning him, note it said he looked intently into heaven and saw the glory of God and Jesus. Paul then begins his address, my brothers. Note once again the connection Paul is drawing between himself and the Jewish authorities. He continues, I have conducted myself toward God. The Greek verb politumai has the connotation of live as a citizen, a polites, in accordance with the laws of the polis. And by extension, it broadens out to mean, I have conducted my life. That conduct has been in good conscience. In other words, Paul's behavior has been motivated by zeal for God, both before and after his experience on the Damascus Road, even up to the current day. He has nothing to hide and nothing to be concerned about. This does not sit well with the high priest Ananias, who upon hearing this orders his attendants to strike Paul in the mouth. The high priest Ananias, a son or son-in-law of Ananus, also known as Annas, served from 47 AD to 58 or 59 AD. Josephus tells us that besides being quite wealthy, he had a reputation for being insolent and quick-tempered. We see that in Antiquities 29:1, number 199. In addition, he was pro-Roman, which eventually led to his assassination in AD 66 by the zealot leader Menachem. The order to slap Paul recalls the slap in the Johannine Passion narrative by the soldier of the high priest of Jesus. Paul responds to the slap with a play on the word strike. God will strike you, you whitewashed wall. Here we see Paul's rabbinic training coming to his aid. Johnson notes that in Deuteronomy 28:22, a curse is levied against those who disobey the commandments, which includes the words, the Lord will smite you. The address that Paul uses, a whitewashed wall, recalls Jesus' reference to the Pharisees as whitewashed tombs because of their hypocrisy. We see that in Matthew 23:27. Then he issues a challenge. Do you sit in judgment upon me according to the law, and yet in violation of the law order me to be struck? Let's look at this statement more closely. First, it's to be noted that the pronoun you is singular, most likely referring to the high priest rather than the whole council. Until the destruction of the temple, the high priest was the president of the Sanhedrin. Thus, Paul addresses Ananias directly. Secondly, the Greek for violation of the law, paranomeo, literally means to act beside the law. Beside para, the law, nomos. Thus, not simply acting illegally, but acting having no regard for the law. Thus, Kurt cites Deuteronomy 1:17. You shall not be partial in judgment. You shall hear the small and the great alike. And you shall not be afraid of the face of man, for the judgment is God's. So Paul implies that the high priest is judging him according to the law, yet strikes him. That is, delivers punishment without hearing any witnesses or testimony. To Paul, this is hypocrisy. The attendant to the high priest replies, would you revile God's high priest? Paul responds that he did not know that this was the high priest. Now that statement can be seen in two ways. Either Paul truly did not recognize the high priest since he had been away from Jerusalem for many years, or he indeed did recognize him but would not acknowledge the fact that he was high priest because he was not acting in a manner consonant with the high priesthood. Then, as Kurtz puts it, in what might be an apology, he cites Exodus 22:27. You shall not curse a ruler of your people. In essence, Paul is telling the high priest and the whole Sanhedrin that he still lives kata to nomon, according to the law, even if the high priest will not. Now, still relying on his rabbinic training, the author comments that Paul was aware of the makeup of the Sanhedrin, Sadducees and Pharisees, and he was well aware of the differences in politics and theology in each group. So he addresses the whole Sanhedrin further. My brothers, again emphasizing his solidarity with them, I am a Pharisee and a son of Pharisees. This is the first explicit reference to Paul's Pharisaic background in Acts. We have a similar statement in his biographical information given in Philippians 3, especially Philippians 3:5. He continues, I am being judged concerning the hope, which is the resurrection of the dead. What Paul hopes for here is that his mention of the resurrection of the dead will divert the attention of the assembly from him and the charges against him onto a long-standing disagreement between the two major parties concerning the notion of resurrection. This is similar to Paul's situation in Athens. The learned members of the Areopagus were staunch believers in the immortality of the soul, to whom the notion of the resurrection of the dead made no sense. Thus, they politely told Paul they would have to hear him on that later. Here, the question of resurrection in general, but more specifically, it's the question of whether the resurrection of Jesus is real. Did he really rise from the dead? The result of Paul's statement was what he expected. A conflict or a dispute broke out among the Pharisees and Sadducees. The group clearly was divided. The narrator then intersperses a verse to give the reader a heads up on what's going on. He says, for the Sadducees say there is no resurrection or angels or spirits, while the Pharisees acknowledge all three. The background of this division is that the denial of resurrection, angels, and spirits stems from the fact that the Sadducees accept only the Torah or the Pentateuch, that is, the first 5 books of the Old Testament. There is no mention of these concepts in those books, hence they reject them. The Pharisees accept all three, because they accept not only the Torah, but also the Nevi'im, the prophets, and the Ketuvim, the writings, as well as the developing oral tradition around those three divisions. The notions of resurrection, angels, and spirits appear in several places in the writings that the Pharisees accept. In fact, the Mishnah tractate Sanhedrin 10:1 notes this Pharisaic position, namely, he that says there is no resurrection of the dead, prescribed in the law, has no share in the life to come. Thus, this was not a simple debate over terminology. The result was shouting and clamor, producing a great uproar in the Sanhedrin chamber. First to express their opinion were the Pharisees, who stood up and argued, literally took up battle, diamakomai, or contended sharply. They said, "We find nothing wicked in this man." Well, of course they wouldn't. On all the key points of the argument, Paul agreed with them. Then they goad the Sadducees. Perhaps a spirit spoke to him, or an angel. As Johnson observes, the Pharisees here express a willingness to recognize some sort of transcendental experience that they can fit within their categories and at the same time use against the Sadducees as working to Paul's purpose, but also fall short of recognizing the key point, which is the reality of the resurrection in Paul's experience of Jesus as Lord. Paul's strategy worked. He had turned the spotlight from himself to the differences between the Pharisees and the Sadducees. But now the dispute over differences was getting out of hand. As a result, the tribune orders his troops to go in and rescue Paul before he was torn to pieces by the Sanhedrin. The Sanhedrin seems to be no less civil than the crowd we just saw in the temple precincts. So the troops go to rescue Paul and take him back to the compound. A second time the tribune has tried and failed to get at the reason why the people were so upset at Paul. The narrative closes with a vision Paul had during the night. The Lord stood by him and said, "Take courage, for just as you have borne witness to my cause in Jerusalem, so must you bear witness in Rome." This marks yet another major turning point in the narrative of Acts. Well, that's about all the time we have for this session. In fact, we're a bit over time. Next time, we shall look at Paul's transfer to Caesarea and his dealings with Minucius Felix and Porcius Festus, the procurators in Caesarea. See you then.